Pittsburgh recently became a pioneer in the transportation world by implementing its own platform for mobility as a service. Move PGH is using the existing transit app and consolidating rates when taking multiple forms of public transit, meaning a passenger can get close to their destination with a bus and rent a bike or electric scooter for the last mile and do so cheaply. There's also another innovative and cost-effective way the city has up its sleeve to create the necessary infrastructure to support these investments. Let's get into why this is so revolutionary. The US has been stuck in a destructive and expensive fad since the post-war era, focusing on the deadliest, costliest, and most wasteful option available. The Netherlands also went through this phase, but reversed it and ended up with its current bike culture. An effort was made to develop this culture. In America, a lack of options is instead presented as freedom to get around without relying on someone else's transportation or schedule. And with your own personal transportation box, it reflects your style, or more accurately, income status, before you've actually exited your vehicle. By not really having much of a public transportation option, America has used car culture to put a needless and stressful burden on anyone hoping to go further than walking distance from their home. But it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. Building a highway for bikes is something that can actually be done much cheaper than building a highway for cars, due to the reclaiming of old infrastructure that was used for different purposes. Similar to New York City's Highline Park, which converted a former railroad into an elevated piece of green space in the city, the proposed conversion of the defunct Brilliant Rail Line into a bike bridge that would connect Homewood and Millville is doing something many human Pittsburghers find difficult: crossing one of the three rivers, in an area that's already pretty unkind regardless of what vehicle you drive, with streets too narrow for most cars and highways intersecting in ways that make it daunting for a bike. The plan really is brilliant too, because it recycles underutilized infrastructure in a way that is useful to something other than cars, and a great way to make sure mobility as a service investments are used because there's an environment where they aren't putting the users at risk. In the process, this plan would also do something about accessibility for different communities in a fun way that's less destructive than what's currently in place. An analysis by Texas A&M's Transportation Institute found that the average American commuter spends 42 hours per year stuck in traffic, while lost time and wasted fuel costs exceed $100 billion a year. Meanwhile, pollution has also been contributing to health problems and climate change. Motor vehicle crashes are also one of the leading causes of death in the US, with more than 35,000 people dying as a result of motor vehicle crashes in just 2015. Americans inherited a car-oriented mentality that is ingrained in everything from design to language. We can see this with the term jaywalking in its origin. Jay at the time was a derogatory term for country folks who would get entranced by city lights and end up wandering into the streets during their trips to the big city, only to get hit by cars. Car lobbying groups latched onto that language and shamed pedestrians out of the streets in advertising and education campaigns they sponsored. And as a result, Americans think pedestrians, and often bikes, don't belong in the streets, and automatically hold them at fault when they get hit by a motorist. This would be like if today we called, and you totally thought I was just going to rip a slur there, didn't you? Unbelievable. In the US, we rely on policies like share the road, and an asymmetrical power dynamic where the group with power also has a cell phone full of apps to distract them from a car they already lack the spatial skills to properly operate. If you want an example of why separate routes for cycling should be made, you don't have to look any further than the recent story out of Houston of a teen who thought it would be funny to roll coal on a group of cyclists, only to accidentally hit 6 of them because he's a teen who's new to driving. But it highlights the fact that America shows deference to drivers to the point that they can get off with murder if they do it with a car. The teen who hit the cyclist reportedly didn't even receive a ticket. I wouldn't be surprised if he was allowed to drive his car home after nearly killing 6 people. By only supporting cars, we've put convenience ahead of safety, whether it's as a driver or a pedestrian, or, just as a human, because we're pumping tons of emissions in the air and leading to circumstances that help the earth catch on fire. There are brave cyclists who manage to weave in and out of cars and traffic like it's nothing, and will fight your car if you drive like a dick. In the Netherlands, which is widely accepted as the cycling capital of the world, these road warrior types are referred to as wheel runners, or wheel runners, which is a pretty badass nickname if I do say so myself. Bike policy in a number of American cities and suburbs only really applies to our own variety of wheel runner, people who battle cars for their slice of the street, with many having the scars to prove it. Well, at one point I did this, when I actually have hair, I kind of got tired of showing up places like I just gotten into a fight. And I also like just being able to ride leisurely for the most part, and fighting cars gets kind of tiring and dangerous. In the Netherlands, people who want to ride like this are called fietsers, or wheel walkers, and policy is made for them instead. The book Building the Cycling City by Melissa and Chris Bruntlett explores this concept, and posits that while it might seem like this is attributable to cultural differences, and there's no way to change things here, there are a few cases in the US in places like Portland, and oddly enough New York City, to demonstrate that this isn't the case. Janet Sadik-Kahn, the former commissioner of the New York City Department of Transportation, wrote about her personal experience creating New York's bike infrastructure with her book Street Fight. The book follows Sadik-Kahn as she fought to set up what has since become a model for the nation in city bike infrastructure in New Amsterdam, borrowing some of the ideas from Old Amsterdam in the city where, to paraphrase Frank Sinatra, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. And that's no different with bike lanes, where Sadik-Kahn faced fierce resistance that she later overcame with planters and paint in ways that made citizens reassess the public space that they had thoughtlessly been giving up to cars. Though individual applications will vary, the approach of using obstacles that make sense and are aesthetically pleasing will help demonstrate the increase of choices the bike infrastructure actually brings. They're like tree-lined streets, only with significantly less work. Building a bike infrastructure is one of the smartest things we could do as a city at this point in time. But more importantly, it lays the groundwork for a massive list of options in the future, while even benefiting people who would never want to ride a bike by removing cyclists from their driving equation. So weirdly, drivers should actually be some of the strongest advocates for bike infrastructure. That being said, if we're being honest, there's always a segment of Americans who don't want to give up any space on the street, and will protest by way of another favorite American pastime, knee-jerk animosity to anything outside the norm. It's very rare that policy interventions benefit people who refuse to use them, but bike infrastructure is different in this way. Most people protesting space being given to bikes, or even worse, demanding additional space for cars, aren't necessarily aware of induced demand, which is the traffic equivalent of if you build it, they will come. Where increasing the number of traffic lanes for cars only causes people to drive that much more on that route, in the end resulting in even worse traffic. If our infrastructure included more than just cars while providing separate means to use public transit or bikes, all of these means of travel would improve. The US has fallen behind other countries in this regard, with the vast majority of investments going to car infrastructure, only seeing bike infrastructure put in place in the last 30 years. Due to this 40 or so years of disproportionate level of influence, there's still a reluctance to challenge cars in America, despite monetary, safety, and space concerns. But who will think of the poor business always comes up as to why we need to surround everything with a massive perimeter of parking spaces. Research has actually found that businesses near bike lanes experience increases in sales, with some businesses even going as far as calling for the removal of parking space minimums on these grounds. Since people are less likely to cede space or embrace a change regardless of how well it's supported, it's important to ease them into it with something that can be removed if it doesn't work. Bike infrastructure is one of the rare areas where you can try change before you buy it. This is where Sadik-Kahn's idea of moving planters before eventually using paint to reclaim street space came in handy. It's a way to temporarily use something that can be removed to see the impact of policy, and possibly alter it before installing something more permanent. Biking stress levels depend on the level of infrastructure investments and safety. However, it's something that can be started with just paint to help raise public interest, usage, and then buy-in for the overall plan for public bikes and transit. Bike infrastructure in many cases can be temporary and modular, which helps for increasing public support and for making decisions in a cautious manner that can adapt if the situation requires it. If your boxy monstrosity seems like it's too big for the street, it's because compared to the horses and carts of that time, it is. Cars are still relatively new, only really coming to popularity in the 1900s, and yet we've been more than willing to destroy all kinds of historical buildings and landmarks in favor of this fad, especially if you were in black or brown neighborhoods, thanks to ideas like slum clearance, which historically saw these neighborhoods as a way to make way for developments of new housing or highways. Fairly often these developments that were supposed to make way for public housing ended up as valuable commercial real estate instead, a trend that continues to this day. While cars have been sold to Americans as a symbol of freedom, all too often that freedom is selectively applied. and comes at a cost to those least able to pay. Not to mention, in the end, it's not even the be-all end-all of transportation that America makes it out to be. Bike infrastructure is often put in place as an attraction of sorts in predominantly higher income and whiter neighborhoods. If there's any legitimate hope in addressing transportation inequality, it's going to require other forms of transit infrastructure to extend beyond the borders of predominantly white neighborhoods. We're holding on to a fad as much as we can by obsessing about cars. Luckily, bikes take up much less space than cars, and infrastructure too narrow for car traffic is perfect for cycling. One of the most immediate changes that could be made would be to increase the number of protected bike lanes. In February 2020, a Pennsylvania state law finally allowed the practice that would flip the placement of bike lanes and parking lanes, which puts the cars on the outside closer to the road while also providing a barrier for cyclists from moving vehicles. That being said, both cyclists and motorists benefit from finding arteries to get people where they need to get to without having their paths colliding. In places with exemplary bike infrastructure experiences, like the recent influxes in skyways in places like New Zealand or China, the best results have come from removing bikes from the rest of traffic. Pittsburgh has some really cool trails on the south side, the north side, and near the universities, among other places, but sometimes cyclists find themselves abruptly and jarringly dropped off in traffic. Pittsburgh recently released a broad plan for transit going 50 years into the future, and the text was the idea of bike highways. This is an investment in public infrastructure that could be an attraction of sorts that would represent the innovative future that Pittsburgh has been noted for. Pittsburgh has the interest in these changes, and it's demonstrated frequently by organizations like Bike Pittsburgh or Critical Mass, as well as public government entities like the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, who have made numerous inroads since their inception with regards to both infrastructure and micromobility projects. There's a long list of people living in and visiting the city who would massively benefit from the prioritization of bike highway projects. St. Louis put in place what's called the Mural Mile Flood Wall, which runs along the riverfront south of the Gateway Arch and showcases the work of more than 250 graffiti artists. Meanwhile, in Pittsburgh, art students are doing projects in obscure stairwells most people won't ever see. These new connectors could both serve as a canvas and feature LEDs in creative ways that would provide lighting for cyclists at night, like the stairwell I mentioned, or like this alley by the Arcade Theater. While autonomous vehicles might represent a massive innovation down the line, Pittsburgh could easily become a leader in more than one mode of transportation by funding bike infrastructure and see a tangible change to improve transportation immediately instead of putting all our eggs in one basket for something that is very much still being developed. For way too many people, there's an expectation of autonomous vehicles being right around the corner, thanks to unscrupulous marketing and overselling of capabilities with names like Tesla's Autopilot. With a name like this, there's an expectation that the car will drive itself, instead of it basically being cruise control plus, it's something that's easily confused by environmental hazards like the moon. Regardless of bad publicity, this doesn't stop people from falling asleep at the wheel or pretending like the car is chauffeuring them around.
It's a Tesla, you feel me? It's like a cabin back here. I could control the climate and all that from my phone, and it's like a living room back here. I'm relaxing in luxury while Elon Musk chauffeurs me.
There are 5 levels of automation, with the lower levels requiring some type of driver to intervene. A lot of people expect us to be at the higher levels, which are 3, 4, and 5, where the technology takes complete control. And we're not there yet. By prioritizing autonomous vehicle projects over that of bicycles, we're threatening to make the same infrastructure mistakes of the past, only with a patina of futurism. Thank you for watching this. As always, I've included resources below, including links to a page supporting the Brilliant Line. I recommend signing up if you'd like to help see this plan actually come to fruition. For more up-to-date information on bringing about more bike infrastructure and changing attitudes in Pittsburgh, I recommend following the Instagram page Critical Mass, which periodically holds bike-ins and other events towards increasing bike consciousness in the city of Pittsburgh. Additionally, I'd recommend checking out the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure's Move Forward PGH page on Instagram as well, which gives updates on various bike infrastructure projects around the city. If you enjoyed this, give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more content, make sure you subscribe. Tell me your secret now, what's in front of me, hey?